All right. Thank you for coming in to adding and subtracting fractions. Some objectives that we're going to cover in this lesson, we're going to understand how to add fractions with common denominators. We're going to understand how to add fractions with uncommon denominators. And we're going to understand different parts of a fraction. So I'm going to share some rules that I like to use when working with fractions. I'm going to show this to you now, and then we will review it a little bit later as we get into some examples. So the first rule that I like to follow is whenever you are adding or subtracting fractions, you must have common denominators. Once we have common denominators, we add or subtract our numerator. That's the first rule I like to follow. The second one is whatever you do to the denominator, you must do the same to the numerator. That was something I want the class to notice and wonder about these two rules is what do they mean, and see if anybody can make some predictions of what we might be doing later on. But for now on, we're just going to move on real quick. So first thing we're going to look at is parts of a fraction. So here we have 1/3 or 1 share of 3. So now we're going to focus on that line, or we like to call it a fraction bar. This is what separates our two numbers from each other. Now we're going to focus up on the 1, and that is the top part of the fraction bar, or they call it the numerator. Now we're going to focus on the 3, which is below the fraction bar, which is called the denominator. So now since we have understanding what the parts of a fraction is, we're going to move on to a problem real quick. So here we're going to be adding fractions with like denominators. So here we have 1/4 plus 2/4. That's what we got. So now we're going to focus on our denominator. What I want you to do, just type in the chat what our denominators are in this problem. All right, so now where is he located? Below the fraction bar, which is 4 and 4. Okay, so we know what our denominators are, just 4. So now let's take a look at our numerator, which is above the fraction bar, right? Now, what two numbers do we have? We got 1 and 2, right? So we have 1 and 2 for our numerator. So at this time, as we picked out what our denominators are and what our numerators are, we're going to take a look at the golden rules real quick. So here, let's just focus on the first part. Whenever you are adding or subtracting fractions, you must have common denominators. Once we have common denominators, we add or subtract our numerator. So now let's take a look at our problem again. So now, are our denominators the same? Just type in the chat real quick. Yes, so our denominators are the same. So our answer, our denominator for our answer is 4, right? Because it's the same. So now all we simply have to do is just add our numerator straight across, which is 1 plus 2 or 2 plus 1, which equals 3. Yep. So our answer is 3/4. All right. So now as I erase this, we are going to, I want you to take a look at this problem. Now this problem, we're going to be adding fractions with uncommon denominators. Now as I get set up, I want you to think about some notice and wonders that you get from this problem. What are some similarities and what are some differences that you notice in this problem? So as I get set up, just write these down in your notebook or type them in the chat real quick. All right, so I'm all set. So what are some similarities and differences that we have? So we're going to work on the same, we're going to do the same process as we did with adding fractions with common denominators. So let's focus on what are our denominators. So what's below fraction bar, right? So we have 8 and 4 for our denominators, right? Now let's take a look at our numerators again. So we have 1 and 5, right? Okay. So we have 1 and 5 as a numerator, 4 and 8 as our denominator. So now let's take a look at the golden rule once again, because we noticed that our denominators are not the same, right? So here's a look at the second part. When whatever you do to the denominator, you must do the same as a numerator. Okay, so let's keep that in mind real quick. So now we notice that 4 and 8 are multiples of each other, right? And we know that 4 plus 4 equals 8. So how many times do we have to multiply 4 to get to 8? If you want, just type in the chat real quick. All right, yep. We multiply 4 twice to get 8. So we get set up. So we know we have to multiply 2 to our denominator to get 8. Now let's look at that rule again. Whatever you do to the denominator, you must do the same to the numerator. So if we multiply 2 to our 4, we have to multiply 2 to our 1, which is in our numerator. What we do to the bottom, we must do to the top. So we get set up like this. So now all we have to do is just some simple multiplication. So we have 2 times 1 is 2. Then we have 2 times 4 is 8. Now we're going to keep our 5/8 the same, which doesn't have to change. So now let's look at our fraction problem now. Now we have 2/8 plus 5/8, right? So now in our denominators, what do we have now? We have 8 and 8, right? So our denominators are the same. And now we have 2 and 5 for our numerators. So now what the golden rule says, once we have common denominators, all we have to do is just add or subtract our numerators, right? So now all we have to do is take 2 plus 5, which is 7, right? So now in this problem, our answer is 7/8. So now we're going to move on to some connections. I just have 3 questions for you. I just want to do a quick check-in after this. What I want you to do is type in the chat a 1 through 5. 1 being I have no idea what we just did, and 5 is everything's making some sense. So the first question I want to ask everybody is, do we understand the golden rules for adding and subtracting fractions? I'll give you a minute to put your answer in the chat real quick. All right, cool. Now we're going to move on to our second question. Do we understand how to create common denominators when they're not the same? When adding or subtracting fractions? Give you a minute. Cool. All right. So now last question. Do we understand how to add and subtract fractions? And if anybody have any questions or still not making sense of what we're doing, that's perfectly okay. We'll work together and get through this. All right, cool. So now I'm just going to leave some time for the group to ask any questions that has come up as we were going through this lesson of adding fractions. All right, so since nobody really had any questions, here's something that I want to leave for everybody to think about, or here's a statement I want everybody to think about for next class. So the process we did for adding fractions is very much the same for subtracting fractions. The only difference is what we are doing. So I want to leave that with you to think about and see if you have any questions for next class period. What we will be doing next is subtracting fractions. Thank you. Have a good day.